Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'm excited to welcome you to the 2022 VAD Academy. My name is Christina Carter Grant, and I serve as the Senior Program Officer for National Leadership in Education here at the Center for Community Progress. The VAD Academy, short for Vacant, Abandoned, and Deteriorated Properties Training Academy, is an intensive training for public, private, nonprofit, and community leaders whose work in communities are impacted by challenges related to VAD properties. From breaking down complex systems to sharing smart strategies for resident engagement and fostering compliance, the VAD Academy aims to equip leaders to help return all properties to purposeful use. Before turning it over to our CEO, Dr. Akila Watkins, to kick off the Academy and introduce our opening speaker, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, type the question into the chat box and, time permitting, our presenters will respond. Replays of today's sessions will be available immediately upon event conclusion by clicking the replay button on the left side of your screen, and presentation decks will be sent in the weeks following. We'll have plenty of breaks scheduled throughout the day, and during those breaks, we invite you to participate in our speed networking feature by clicking on the People button on the left side of your screen, completing your interest, and connecting with fellow VAD participants. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please email me at Christina Carter Grant, ccarter@communityprogress.org. Again, that's ccarter@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Akila.
Thank you so much, Christina. Hello, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to the 6th Annual Vacant, Abandoned, and Deteriorated Properties Training Academy. My name is Akila Watkins, and I'm President and CEO at the Center for Community Progress. And I welcome you all today. The Center for Community Progress is a nonprofit leader addressing vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. We are closing the equity gap in America by helping eliminate and prevent problem properties. We're excited that you can join us for this special learning event today. The VAD Academy is designed for people like you that have a commitment to equitably addressing problem properties. Today, you'll learn things like, what are the drivers for vacancy and abandonment? And how can my community create a coordinated strategy towards addressing this issue? What are the elements of an efficient, effective, and equitable delinquent property tax enforcement system? Or how can a land bank help build equitable, inclusive, resilient neighborhoods? We'll then conclude the Academy with a presentation on data and markets, which will tie together elements of everything you learned today and show you how powerful data can be in advancing your revitalization goals. I strongly encourage you to really get engaged. Take notes, ask questions, and if there are topics you ever feel you need further clarification on, reach out to our VAD faculty. They are subject matter experts, and they are here to help you. And as Christina previously mentioned, take advantage of our speed networking feature. Beyond participating in today's session, we invite you to use speed networking to connect with fellow VAD participants. You may find someone with shared revitalization goals and/or opportunities for collaboration, even outside the Academy. Before I turn things over to Alan Malik, I want to first thank Truist for their support that is bringing this training to each of you cost-free. Thank you very much, Truist. I'm also happy to announce that we have officially launched registration for the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference. This year's RVP will take place in Chicago, Illinois from September 7th through the 9th, and we hope to see all of you there. RVP is our signature national conference that brings together hundreds of professionals from around the globe to learn about cutting-edge policies and practices in the field of revitalizing vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties as assets for residents. Themed Responding to Crisis, Building an Equitable and Resilient Future, this year's conference will focus on positioning community leaders to radically imagine and create a future that centers equitable development and community resiliency. Learn more about RVP and register today at www.reclaimingvacantproperties.org. Lastly, I'm excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Alan Malik, who will be kicking off the VAD Academy with a session on foundational concepts for understanding VAD properties. Alan Malik serves as Senior Fellow here at Community Progress. Alan is nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, and urban revitalization, and has worked with local governments and community organizations across the country and globally to develop creative policies and strategies to rebuild their cities and neighborhoods. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Akila. And good morning, everyone. And by the way, I'd just like to add to what Akila said, is the RVP conference is really a valuable event. It's a meaty, substantive event where you can both learn a great deal and meet a lot of people who are sharing the same concerns as issues as you are. So I'll just want to second her recommendation. If you can make it to Chicago in September, it'd be well worth your while. So without further ado, this morning, I'm going to talk about basically the roots of vacant, abandoned, and distressed properties, why they happen, and how they impact communities. Now, to some extent, this is going to overlap a little bit with what I'm going to talk about later this afternoon about markets and data. But I think that's important because the market is one of the most fundamental things to understand about vacant, abandoned properties. So next slide. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about three different types of properties that raise similar but different issues. First one is vacant buildings, then vacant lots, which in urban areas are usually places that had vacant buildings, but where those buildings have been demolished, and then occupied problem properties, particularly rental properties. Next slide. So the question is, what causes these properties? Why do they happen? Why are there so many empty, abandoned properties in America's villages, towns, and cities? Literally millions of them. Next slide. So it all starts basically with supply and demand. If supply is equal to or if supply is greater than demand, you have a weak market. There are more houses than there are people who want them. If supply is equal to or less than demand, you're likely to have a strong market. So we've been reading for the last couple of years about how houses are being sold for tens of thousands of dollars above their list price. That is because you have a strong market and you have too few houses for the number of people who want to buy them. On the other hand, if you have a weak market and supply is greater than demand, then people will not be able to fill up the houses that already exist. Next slide. So when we talk about demand and we talk about why there is weak demand, there are three different things basically that can trigger weak demand and create situations where you have a supply that not enough people or nobody wants. Their location, physical deterioration, and market obsolescence. So next slide. Okay, so for example, here is what is basically the same house, a house that was built by the millions during the late 19th and early 20th century in our cities. So here you have one of those houses, and now these prices were a couple of years ago, so they might be higher now. But you can see in Newton, Massachusetts, which is a highly desirable suburb of Boston, which has a very strong economy and a strong housing market, that house was selling for $800,000. In Springfield, about 100 miles to the west, a weak market, but not that weak a market, it was selling for $200,000. In Cleveland, which is a very weak market, sad to say, even though it's a wonderful city, the same house was selling for $69,000. So this indicates location is critical, whether it's different regions of the United States or whether it's in the same city. You know, in a city like Baltimore or Detroit or even Cleveland for that matter, one neighborhood, an essentially identical house will sell for $500,000. In another neighborhood, that house is essentially without value. Nobody wants it. It sits empty. Next slide, please. The other factors, a lot of houses simply deteriorate. If you have a neighborhood where there is low demand and where houses sit empty, they start to look like the house in the picture. And at some point, with a lot of houses, either the house deteriorates to the point where it really cannot be rehabilitated. Now, that house in the picture, in all likelihood, simply cannot be rehabilitated. Or it may be physically possible, but so expensive that it's not worth it. The other factor, and we see this, for example, in quite a few of the suburbs that were built in the cities, around the cities, or inside the cities during the period right after World War II. You have houses that simply are too small or too poorly equipped to be attractive to the market. In fact, in Rochester, the head of a nonprofit I was talking to said, I found it a fascinating thing. In the neighborhoods where his organization worked, if a house had only one bathroom, it would never find a home buyer. If it was in decent shape, an investor might buy it to rent out, but no home buyer would buy a house with only one bathroom. So he came up with the brilliant idea of scrounging up some money to go into houses and add a half bath so that they would then be appealing to potential home buyers. But either way, you have just simply some conditions where home buyers just are not interested. So next slide, please. So what happens, and again, I'm going to explore this in greater detail when I talk about markets this afternoon, but once weak demand starts to happen in a neighborhood, unless it's reversed, it creates a vicious cycle, because weak demand means people are less likely to want to keep their property. So for example, if you own a house in a neighborhood and you know that neighborhood, that house has virtually no value, you may ask yourself, why am I paying taxes on it? Why am I making mortgage payments? This house is worthless. So what you see, and in fact, statistically, you can show there's a very strong relationship between foreclosures and property tax delinquency and vacant and property abandonment. People stop paying taxes. People stop paying mortgages. People also stop putting money into their house. They might look at it and say, you know, again, if this house has no value, why should I do that repair? Why not I'll just fix the plumbing with duct tape and let the next owner worry about it. And then, of course, all of these lead to deterioration and ultimately to abandonment. Now, as long as somebody lives in it, that's one thing. But if somebody moves, somebody passes, then it's quite possible that that house will not find a buyer. And then, of course, what happens is the more you have deteriorated, substandard, visibly in bad shape property in a neighborhood, the more you have abandoned property in a neighborhood, then what you're going to start to see is people come in and think about maybe buying or renting in that neighborhood. They see these houses in bad condition. They see these abandoned houses and they decide to go somewhere else. And that, of course, makes the demand even weaker. And so it becomes a race to the bottom. And that is what has happened in quite a few neighborhoods. And ultimately, you get to a situation. And in a piece I wrote a few years ago, I called this hyper vacancy. At some point, if you have too many vacant houses and vacant lots in a neighborhood. Now, I'm not exactly sure that you can put a precise number on too many, but I would say if you're talking about the sum of vacant abandoned buildings and vacant lots being more than 30 or 40%, you're definitely up there. You have hyper vacancy. And at that point, basically, the neighborhood housing market is about vacant properties. It's no longer functioning as a classic market where people are buying and selling and moving in and so forth. And ultimately, that's what happens in a lot of neighborhoods in a lot of our older cities, where the overall demand is not strong to begin with. So that's the basic pattern. Now, next. Okay, the other part of this is VAD properties are not just vacant properties, because one of the biggest problems in a lot of American cities, and in some cities, when I talk to people and I go to different cities, some of them will say the problem with problem landlords, problem rental properties is a greater one than the problem with vacant properties. Now, there are a few things important to know about rental housing. First is most of it is small scale. Over half of all the rental housing in the United States is 1 to 4 family buildings. And about a third of all the rental housing in the United States is single family houses. And that percentage is growing. The second thing, and even though this looks like it's starting to shift, because there's been a real growth of interest on the part of large corporations in rental housing in the last couple of years. But still, the great majority of landlords are small mom and pop landlords, either individuals, couples, or small groups of people who maybe have come together to form some kind of pool to own a few properties. And most of these small landlords do not own thousands or even hundreds of properties. Many of them own 1, 2, 5, or 10 properties. Third thing, most low-income families live in rental housing. And most of the great majority of them do not live in subsidized housing. The vast majority of American low-income renters do not have access either to vouchers or to a subsidized unit. They live in what is known as NOAH housing, or naturally occurring affordable housing. The problem, of course, is number one, it's not really affordable to them, because if you're truly low income, if you're a single mom working on a job with erratic hours at a Walmart or something like that, and are making maybe $15,000, $20,000 a year, you can't afford even the least expensive house without subsidy. But in addition, problem is most of this, I shouldn't say most, that's not fair. Much of this housing is unsafe or unhealthy or otherwise substandard. And that means it can have problems of lead, it can have problems of mold, it can have leaks, it can have unreliable heating or hot water. There are thousands of things that can go wrong with a house or an apartment. And the rental housing that low-income people in this country live in is very often a problem for them and for their neighbors. Next slide. Okay, so this is a pervasive problem throughout the United States, particularly in lower income communities. And as single family houses have been flipping from owner occupancy to rental occupancy, it has become greater, especially as a lot of the new owners are either speculators or don't really know what they're doing. And it's particularly serious in areas where sales prices are very low relative to rents, because there a landlord is motivated to try to just maximize how much rent he or she can get out of the property, and the hell with the long-term effects on that property. So as a result, in low value, weak demand areas, problem rental properties are very often a way station to housing abandonment. And so any city that's looking at the problems of problem properties has to be focusing not just on the vacant properties, which are basically at their end game, but look at how they regulate rental housing and how good a job the municipality does in keeping track of the landlords and making sure that properties are maintained to a basic standard of health and safety. And that in itself is a huge issue, but is critically important. So moving on, next slide. Now, the most fundamental driver of vacant properties is weak market demand. And in fact, if you look around the country and you look at cities like, say, San Francisco or Seattle or Washington, D.C., you will find those cities tend to have relatively few vacant properties. Now, that is not because those cities are necessarily any better than a host of other cities at managing their vacant inventory or getting them back into productive use. That's because their market is stronger and there's more demand for housing in those cities. But given that the fundamental issue is the market, the next question is it just the market? And the answer is no, it is not just the market. And the key area that is critically, important to understand is that many cities, towns, counties, states, and so forth pursue policies that actively work to make things worse rather than better. And so let's talk about a few of those. Next slide. Okay, there are a number of ways in which policies and practices can make things worse. Okay, the first one is mortgage foreclosure. And again, this is not a huge issue at the moment, fortunately, but has been over the years. Mortgage foreclosure in many states is a process that goes on for years. I live in New Jersey, and if you stop paying your mortgage, you're a homeowner in New Jersey, and you stop making your mortgage payments tomorrow, it's a reasonably good bet that it'll be something between 3 and 5 years before you actually lose your property and the bank takes it. Now, during that period, one thing that happens is that very often homeowners, or even more landlords, who have gone into the foreclosure process, at some point they will decide, hey, I'm toast. One way or another, I'm going to lose this house. I'm going to walk. So what you find is in thousands of cases that you have a property that is vacant, the homeowner has disappeared, the bank has initiated foreclosure but has not taken title to it yet. The property is in limbo. In other cases, and this is particularly true in very low value, low income neighborhoods, a bank will start the foreclosure process without the slightest intention of actually taking the property. They don't want the property, but they figure if they start the foreclosure process, they might squeeze a few more payments out of the owner. So ultimately, the owner disappears. The bank doesn't even go through the paperwork to take title to the property, and the property goes into limbo. And in some places, these have come to be called zombie properties. And that's a pretty good description. So at least a couple of states, and I would say New Jersey and New York are two, where the state has actually passed a law that says if the owner disappears, the bank is responsible for maintaining the property, even though they haven't actually taken title to it yet. So that helps address the situation. But the foreclosure process is a major impediment. But what's probably even worse is the tax foreclosure process. As you all probably know, the United States system is basically you have to pay property taxes. And in order to, shall we say, encourage you to pay your property taxes, the law in different states provides that if you don't, the city or the county can either auction off the property or auction off what's known as a tax lien, which somebody can buy. And then if you don't, you have a certain amount of time to pay what you owe. And if you don't pay, then they can take the property. So the upshot is that if you don't pay your property taxes, you can lose your property. One thing that's quite interesting is if you look at other countries around the world, this is rarely the case. In other countries, which all have property taxes, or most of them do have property taxes, but they don't take your property. They may garnish your wages, they may seize your firstborn child, but they don't take your property. In the United States, we take your property. So what this means is essentially what's happened is we have a system where the government, instead of collecting the taxes itself, relies on third parties, investors, speculators, what have you, to buy these properties, buy these liens, and then make the municipality whole. So the upshot is thousands of properties fall into the hands of, again, speculators, investors, and other people who have no real interest in the community and only want to see whatever value they get out of the property. And if they can't get value, they walk away. So the municipality has basically entered into a kind of a devil's bargain. They get their taxes, but the properties go into limbo. So that's another system where policies work against another. Now, I've got to say, most cities do not do a very good job at code enforcement. What I mean by that is now just about every city has inspectors who respond to complaints. But the problem with responding to complaints is about 4 or 5-fold. First, an awful lot of tenants, especially low-income people, especially immigrants, people who don't have good command of English, or people who are undocumented, are reluctant to complain because for fear of being evicted. Second, in the best case, if you have a complaint, you make it, an inspector responds, the landlord fixes it. It doesn't help the rest of the properties in the community, and it may not even fix the property because that complaint may be about only one thing of many things wrong with that property. So essentially what you're doing is you're running around putting Band-Aids on scattered wounds without even knowing whether they're the most serious wounds or not. So what some cities have gotten into is systematic, proactive inspections, where all properties are inspected on a regular basis. And in fact, some cities even track the outcomes. So they inspect property. So they determine who are the good landlords, who are the problems, which properties are the problems, and they set up a system to make sure they inspect the problem properties more often and have a lighter touch on the responsible landlords of the good properties. And that way you can actually start to make a difference. But most cities don't do that. Now, another area, and I won't go into it in detail, is the whole, do people have access to mortgages on reasonable terms? Do people have access to home improvement funds? Can people get the money they need to either buy or maintain their properties? Now, I think things have improved to some extent in recent years, but there's still a real issue. And I'll just mention in passing, one of the worst things that happened to a lot of neighborhoods in this country was the subprime lending system that erupted in the late 90s and went on until it exploded roughly around 2007. And that meant that thousands and thousands of properties went into foreclosure or were abandoned because people were holding untenable mortgages and too much debt, and their properties went into underwater. And one thing I might add, I mean, it's not a surprise to anybody, is that the subprime lending lenders targeted, to a large extent, communities of color. And those areas were hardest hit. And to this day, many of them have not recovered from that blow that was inflicted during the foreclosure crisis. So finally, and I think, again, this doesn't require a great deal of elaboration, real estate practices. Now, we know, and I'm going to talk about it this afternoon in the context of market in more detail, but we have a long history of discriminatory real estate practices in this country, going back to the restrictive covenants of the 1920s and 1930s, steering, redlining, etc. I think things are better than they were, but they're not where they need to be. And I think a lot of you have probably read about some of the issues that have come out in the last few years about the appraisal industry and the practice of either explicit or implicit racial discrimination that's going on there. So all of these things are matters of the public policy, how government either conducts its business or how government regulates other people, like whether it's realtors, whether it's banks, and so forth, that affect properties. And they have a powerful impact on problem properties. Both, they can make things better if you have good code enforcement, good regulatory systems, good capital access, and so forth. You can make things better. If you have bad systems, you make things worse. Next slide, please. Just in passing, one of the byproducts of natural disasters is often vacant and abandoned properties, because whenever you have hurricanes, massive floods, earthquakes, people leave, properties are damaged, properties can become unusable, and often impossible to restore. Now, in some cases, they can be rebuilt. In some cases, not. There are huge issues currently because, as we know, the frequency and the magnitude of natural disasters is likely to increase, perhaps significantly, over the coming years. It's already increased relative to what things were like 5, 10, 20, 50 years ago. And what that means is as we have more disasters, we're going to have more properties that become damaged or that become unusable. And what happens to those properties can be a very complicated question. Should they be rebuilt? Should they be rebuilt in place? Should people relocate? There are a whole series of complicated issues involving VAD properties with disasters that especially communities where you're potentially in the path of a natural disaster in the future should start thinking about in advance. So, next slide, please. Another issue, and this is very timely, I think, when the pandemic began, gosh, that was a little over 2 years ago, there was a lot of thinking and concern and speculation and worry about what the effects of the pandemic would be. And I've got to admit, I was one of those who worried and who wrote some stuff about it. And there were two big issues with respect to the potential of vacant properties and problem properties that were widely flagged. Because one thing we knew, millions of people lost their jobs, millions of people lost their source of income. That meant that millions of people were unable to pay rent, and still more millions were perhaps unable to make mortgage payments. And so the question was that going to result in evictions? Was that perhaps going to result in small landlords? And a lot of small landlords are just one or two notches above their tenants in terms of their income and their resources. And was it going to result in foreclosures? And to the extent that it did, would it trigger more deterioration of property, more abandonment, and evictions and abandonment of properties? So this was a huge concern. And it's interesting to look at this point at what happened. Now, we know the COVID-19 is not gone. And we don't know, it may never be gone. But as the world gets back to some version of normal, and as the moratoria have lifted, and as people have gone back to work and unemployment has gone back down and so forth, I think we can tell to what extent were these predictions borne out. And believe it or not, there's some good news. Next slide. Okay, now here's the thing. There's an organization called Eviction Lab, which has been tracking evictions in a cluster of states and a cluster of cities in close to real time. And what we've been finding is very interesting. In the great majority of cities, after the moratoria ended, evictions have gone up, back up, but they have not spiked. The fears of a foreclosure tsunami, that there would be this amazing explosion of millions and millions of evictions going on all over the country, has not happened. Now, does that mean everything is great? Absolutely not. Because the level of evictions that took place before COVID was a national scandal. And what we're seeing is that evictions are coming back to where they're typically at or maybe slightly below the level before COVID. But what we're now pretty convinced of is that we are not going to see a spike in evictions relative to what we had as what you might call the baseline rate. And one thing that's really important about this is, to my mind, this shows two key things, and it's worth bearing in mind. The biggest one is that if you, and this shows, it does make sense sometimes to throw a great deal of money at a problem. The federal government has provided states and cities with $47 billion for emergency rental assistance payments for tenant, and most of that money is getting spent. And as far as we can tell, most of that money is going to people in need. And that has made a huge difference in terms of mitigating the problem. The second is that people realize landlords are not completely crazy. And if you had a tenant who was a reliable paying tenant before the pandemic and has her job back and is likely to be a reliable tenant going forward, then most landlords, especially small landlords and local landlords, will cut that tenant some slack. Because not necessarily because they're wonderful human beings. Now, some are undoubtedly, but it's rational behavior. Because if you have a tenant who is a good pay and will be a good pay in the future, by evicting that person, the apartment becomes vacant for some months. You have no idea whether your new tenant will be a reliable pay. And in any event, that's not going to help you get the money back. So the upshot is things have not been as bad as they could be. They're worse than they should be, but not because of COVID. Next slide. Yeah. The other thing that is not only interesting, but actually kind of amazing is a lot of people were concerned that we would see a wave of foreclosures similar to the 07, 08, 09, as you can see them. Actually what's happened, and now we have about 6 to 9 months worth of data since the moratoria on foreclosures and the forbearance ended. Foreclosures are not only not going up significantly, they are incredibly low, even compared to the baseline rate. And basically, there's something worth thinking about here. The main reason, or a major reason for foreclosures, two major reasons, back in 08, 09, 2010 was twofold. One is millions of people had really bad mortgages that they simply could not afford to pay or didn't make sense to pay because of the subprime business. Number two, millions of people were underwater. Their houses were losing value and their mortgages were often more than the value of the house, so they had no equity to lose. Today, it's the opposite. People, by and large, have mortgages that they can afford to pay now that they are back at work. Most lenders have tacked the arrears onto the end of the mortgage. Plus, houses are worth more and more, which is an affordability problem. But for homeowners, they now have equity in their houses. And so they are going to work overtime to keep from going into foreclosure and losing their homes. So the upshot is foreclosures are down. So in many respects, from the standpoint of vacant and distressed properties, we're coming out of the pandemic in reasonably good shape. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent. Next slide, please. So in terms of looking at what to do, and these are 4 general points that I'd like to just throw out for the future, is first, if you're a local official or if you're working in local government or in state government or involved with these matters, first, not necessarily in any order, look at the policies and practices in your community, in your region, and your state, and change the ones that are working to make the problem worse. Second, revise state laws. There are a lot of state laws in many states that hinder cities' efforts to deal with these problems, especially in some of the red states like North Carolina or Virginia. But also revise local ordinances and think about how you can change your code enforcement or your housing standards or your inspection ordinance to make it more proactive and get better results. Third, really look at what is blocking the market. Do you have areas where people would want to live, but there's some reason why they aren't going there, or where people would want to stay, but for whatever reason they're leaving? Figure out how to unblock those markets and make that work. And then finally, of course, be prepared for the unexpected. Because one of the basic rules of if you're doing anything like this, as I'm sure most of you all know, is things keep coming out of left field at you when you least expect them. Now I'd like to shift gears, next slide please, to how vacant and abandoned and distressed properties affect communities. Next slide, please. Okay. The first thing is we know they're bad. There's been a lot of research on this. They impose huge costs on municipal governments, whether it's in terms of policing, code enforcement, maintenance, not to mention they reduce property values. So overall, they're reducing the tax revenues that the municipality gets, and they're devaluing their neighbor's property. They increase crime as well as the perception of crime. They increase fire risk. They trigger negative behavior because people look at them and they say, well, if I'm sitting next to a vacant shell, I'm not going to maintain my property. And overall, they undermine resident confidence in the neighborhood. So all of these things have been well documented in research and mean that these are massive impacts. Next slide, please. As far as municipal costs, just to give some example, Detroit currently, now I apologize, I should change this slide because the $250 million bond issue in Detroit did pass, and now it's being spent to demolish or stabilize vacant properties. $250 million is still not chump change. And Baltimore did a study and found that just public safety costs run almost $1,500 per vacant property. So this is a huge impact on local government. Next slide, please. Now this slide over on the left is an interesting one. What it shows, and this was done in Youngstown, shows that as the vacancy rate goes up by census tract, the property value, the median sales price goes down. Not a surprise. But for those of you who are at least math geeks or remember your calculus back from high school, what's interesting about the sales price trend is it's not a linear trend. It's a logarithmic trend, which means in this case, that the sales price drops very quickly from the neighborhoods with the fewest vacant properties to sort of the next tier, and then more gradually as more vacant properties are added. So it's the change from very few to more vacant properties that does most of the damage. And the same thing came out in a study in Philadelphia, is they looked at what the effect was on the value of the neighboring properties by having a vacant property on your block, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more. The graph on the right shows that effect. And what it shows is that the first vacant property on the block does 2/3 of the damage. Now, these are residential blocks. Philadelphia has a gazillion blocks made up of row houses, so it's a relatively easy city to do these kind of studies. But 2/3 of all the damage was done by the first vacant property, which again has a significant impact on how do you think about this from a policy standpoint. And one of the basic principles is, if you're working as a city government or a CDC on a block that has, let's say, 4 or 5 vacant properties, and you get 3 of them and there's still 2 left, that's not a bad thing, but you're not going to change the trajectory of that block. You're only going to change the trajectory of that block if you get all of them done, because any one does most of the damage. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very interesting study. Somebody I think this was done in Pittsburgh as it happened, but these people looked at the effect of foreclosures when the foreclosures resulted in vacancies. Because foreclosure in itself doesn't do anything to the property. It's a legal process. But very often foreclosures lead to vacancies. And so what they looked at is what happened to the crime level on the block when you had these vacancies. And what you found is, even though the foreclosure process itself didn't have an effect, but once the foreclosed property became vacant, crime spiked. But here's the other part, which I've shown with my little red circle and the residual effect. After the property was reoccupied, crime continued to be higher in the blocks that had the vacancies than the blocks that had never had the vacancies. Not as much as while the properties were vacant, but there was a residual effect of vacancy that lasted beyond the actual vacancy itself. So that is something to be very concerned about. Next slide. Here's another, in this case, what I did is I looked at tax delinquency and what happened in the tax sales in Trenton, New Jersey, and mapped that against the vacancy rate by neighborhood. And the first, on the left, you see the percent of houses that were tax delinquent compared to the vacancy rate. And by the way, this is all about residential vacancy rates and residential sales, not commercial. So as you can see, the relationship between tax delinquency, not paying your property taxes, and vacancy is about as precise as any relationship between 2 variables can be. Okay. The more vacancies, the fewer tax payments. But the other thing that's important now, in New Jersey, like many states, when the city puts up the tax liens, investors get to buy the liens. But if investors don't buy the liens, they become the city's property, and then the city can foreclose. And by the way, the business of buying tax liens is a very sophisticated business. The investors are sophisticated. They do a lot of due diligence. A lot of them are large corporations with a lot of money behind them. And so this is a good indication of how the sort of the larger market feels about a neighborhood, whether investors are buying the liens. So what you can see is the higher the vacancy rate, the fewer liens bought by investors. So again, this basically means that as vacant properties go up, both the property owners in the neighborhood and outside investors lose confidence in the neighborhood. So to wrap up, next slide, 2 basic problems. I think I would not suggest that vacant, abandoned, and distressed problems are the cause of neighborhood problems. The underlying causes are many and very different. They have to do with poverty. They can have to do with racism. They can have to do with the weak economy of a city or a region where people are leaving and because there are no opportunities. There are a lot of reasons for neighborhood distress. But what we do know is that whatever the underlying reasons for neighborhood distress, vacant and distressed properties make the situation worse, make it harder for communities to address the underlying problems, and above all, undermine the faith of the people in those neighborhoods in the future of their neighborhoods. So for all of these reasons, I think this is a critical issue for anybody who works in a community that has significant vacant property issues should be focusing on this issue as a major effort, because I think unless you can get a handle on this issue, it's very hard to get through this to the underlying problems of racism, economic distress, poverty, and other factors that are driving neighborhood decline in this country. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'm open to questions. Now, let's see. There are a lot of questions, and I'll try to answer some of them quickly. Okay, just very quickly, the Philadelphia study is about vacant houses. Now, I should just spend a couple of minutes on vacant lots. I really didn't talk about vacant lots, which is something I have been remiss at. But vacant lots are created when you knock down a vacant house or factory or office building and so forth. And cities that have been involved in demolitions for decades have a lot of vacant lots. By the reasonable estimate, there are over 100,000 vacant lots in Detroit, and there are perhaps as many as 30 or 40,000 in the city of Philadelphia. So now a vacant lot is a problem as well. And if it's neglected, if it's trashed, if it becomes dirt and has debris and, cigarette boxes and candy wrappers and everything riddling it. However, unlike vacant houses, there are a lot of things you can do to a vacant lot that can help mitigate the damage at much less expense. And one of the ones I'll just mention briefly, because I think it's such a great program, is that in Philadelphia, they have a program called Landcare that's a partnership between the city and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And they actually go into vacant lots. They put down grass. They plant maybe a small tree or two, put a nice split rail fence around the perimeter of the lot. And what people have discovered is that when people do that, and that costs maybe about $1,500 a lot, not only crime is less, people's fear of crime, and that's as important as the actual crime, is less. And and people do not trash those lots even remotely as often as they will a lot which is sitting there just sort of dirt, unfenced, asking to be dumped on. So currently, I forget the exact number. I think there are over 10,000 lots in the city of Philadelphia that are part of this Landcare program. And it's something that any city should think seriously about doing. So let's see. I am not aware of any studies in South Carolina, but I suspect there are some somewhere. There researchers doing studies everywhere. Okay, one city, a city that's a good model for monitoring landlords. There are a couple of them. One I would point to is Minneapolis. Minneapolis has been systematically tracking their landlords and their rental properties for many years now, I think over 2 decades. They have an incredible database. They use that to determine which landlords are responsible and maintain their properties, which are sort of middling, and which are problems. And based on that, they've set up inspection schedules where all of the landlords in the third category, the problem category, those properties are inspected every year. Properties in the middling category are inspected every 3 years. In the good category, every 8 years. So basically what they're saying is if you're a good landlord, and I should make it clear, by the way, that there are lots of good landlords and lots of responsible investors, but there are others, of course. But if you're a good landlord, what they're saying is we're going to have a very light touch on you. We're not going to give you a hard time. If you're a problem landlord, then we're going to come down on you a lot harder. And they charge fees to the problem landlords that are significantly higher than to the good landlords. They also have programs that work with tenants that provide tenant advocacy services and try to resolve problems. So I would say whether they're a great model, that's perhaps a bit of a reach, but they are a good model. And there's another city, it's a small city, which is an inner ring suburb of Minneapolis called Brooklyn Center, which has a similar, and I would say even more aggressive program where they inspect their problem landlords every 6 months. They also require the problem landlords to come up with a remedial action plan that they have to get approved before they can get their rental license renewed. And I should mention, by the way, a lot of cities do what's called rental licensing, which is a very valuable tool because it means you can actually get a handle on who the landlords are, how they're doing, and require them to, provide proper living conditions for their tenants. And just parenthetically, I will say that for anybody who believes that rental licensing is somehow an infringement of human rights, I would say in a country where we license people, we require people in some states to have a license to sell minnows to fishermen. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to require people who are providing an essential service in the form of housing to people who are often in vulnerable positions to be licensed. Let's see. So I'm looking at, unfortunately, there's an interesting question. This is a good one, and I wish there was serious research on it, which is from Manny Patola saying, is there any study on how long it takes until whatever the elevated crime associated with vacant property starts to subside? And the short answer is what we need much more of is longitudinal studies. What we tend to have a lot of are these snapshot studies. But snapshots don't tell you what's going on in a neighborhood over time. And the reason I showed that Pittsburgh study is one of the very few that shows the trend over time. And it unfortunately only went about maybe 6 months after the property was reoccupied. So we definitely need to have more studies that look at how things change over time. Because now we have seen there is a very good study that was done in Cleveland some years ago that looked at the effect of rehabbing vacant properties on neighborhood. I don't think they looked at crime. I think they looked at the effect on foreclosures and the effect on market prices. And again, they found a very interesting thing. And it's been a while since I looked at the study, so I think I'm getting it right. But the stronger the neighborhood to begin with, the bigger the positive impact. And I think a major reason for this was that in all likelihood, in the most distressed neighborhoods, where they found that rehabbing vacant properties had really had little or no impact, the problem was they weren't rehabbing enough vacant properties, or they weren't rehabbing, or they weren't dealing with the other issues that were dragging that neighborhood down. While in some neighborhoods, which only had a few vacant properties and were otherwise relatively stable neighborhoods, by fixing those vacant properties, you could have a major impact. So it's a complicated issue, and we know we need to understand more about how these things operate over time. Okay, now here's an interesting point about it's not phrased as a question, but I think it really is a question. It is about selling vacant land in side yards and lots to adjacent property owners. That is a great program, but now a lot of cities have adopted what they call, typically they're called side yard programs. And if you own a property and there's a vacant lot that the city owns next to you, they give you the property either for $1 or $100 or some nominal amount. It does a couple of things. It gets the property off the city's books, and it gives a property owner the opportunity to have a larger yard, more open space, do stuff with it. The danger of the program is this: if you don't vet the people you're selling it to properly, you can find that all you're doing is creating a revolving door. I mean, one of the things, I think it's St. Louis set up the program. So if a property owner wants a vacant lot, they get to, I think, lease it from the city for a year or two. And if they maintain it properly and improve it and so forth, then they get title to it. The other thing is some programs will make sure only give lots to homeowners. Other will give lots to whomever is the adjacent property. Some, again, try to vet the owners carefully. Some basically just simply give it, no questions asked, to the adjacent owner. So I think it's important that the program be carefully designed to make sure that the only people who get the lot, side yards, are people who you can have a pretty good expectation that they will maintain them properly, because otherwise you're going to get a revolving door. And there's one city that I won't mention by name that has been doing this far too promiscuously, shall we say, than I consider appropriate, at least. And they're seeing a lot of these just come back in subsequent year tax foreclosure sales. So, yeah, vacant lots have a lot of potential. But the other thing is, and they can be, again, community assets, whether it's community gardens, mini parks, things of that sort. A key issue is, and this is one of the nice things I like about the Landcare program, it's very low maintenance. Because one of the problems with community gardens are wonderful, and they are a great asset to a community. But they are very high maintenance. And very often there are a few people, kind of community ramrods, you might say, who are taking the lead in maintaining them, mobilizing their neighbors, all that sort of thing. And if you lose just a couple of people, whether they pass or move away or get involved in other stuff, a community garden can go under. So the tricky thing is to really be very careful. There are incredible opportunities in vacant lots, but you have to really be sure that you have the capacity within the neighborhood to sustain that over time. Okay, we talked about abutters. Let's see what else we got. Bear with me. Are there any examples of metro regions or states instituting policies to control sprawl to prevent the devaluation? Yeah, this is, again, it's getting kind of far afield, but I would say there are very few. In fact, really the only one that is really an effective program is in the Portland, Oregon area, where you have a regional government that is actually elected, has teeth, and has maintained an urban growth boundary. And now the problem with, there's a tricky balance here, because if you're too strict about limiting sprawl, limiting outward movement, limiting growth of the area, if you're in an area where there is strong demand, if you're too strict, what you're going to do as a result of limiting sprawl is push house prices for the existing stock up, because you're limiting the ability of the market to build enough houses to meet people's needs. So the trick is to find a way to make sure that enough housing can be built to meet the needs of the people living in or moving into the neighborhood, and still preserve open space and preserve the character of the area, and not simply allow farmland and open space to be gobbled up willy-nilly. And a big part of that is not only allowing, but encouraging higher density development, because you look at many parts of this country and you see farms gobbled up for McMansions on 1, 2, 3, and 5 acre lots. And you just say, why? Let's see. There's an interesting issue about the ERAP program, and there's a comment from one of the participants about how it didn't require budgeting education, so it's, people who are not accustomed to paying rent are getting into the hole again. I'm somewhat sympathetic, but basically I think the key of the program, and remember, it is incredibly difficult for states and cities to get huge amounts of money out quickly and efficiently to people. And realistically, I think if they had required that in order to get a grant, you as a tenant would have to go through some kind of a education in terms of budgeting, finance, and so forth, the take up of the program would have been far slower. The bureaucratic difficulties in organizing, just think about the difficulties in organizing the education program for literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of tenants around the country. I think realistically, the program was designed to get the money out to people, and that's the best you could realistically ask of it. Now, I think one of the things that cities should be thinking about is, how do city governments and CDCs and housing counseling agencies and all those organizations start thinking about how to improve landlord-tenant relations, how to provide better tenant education, because we have to remember that you have problem landlords, you also have problem tenants. So I think this is something that I'm hopeful that now that the immediate crisis has been averted, maybe some city governments can increasingly start to focus on making change happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alan. That was a great presentation. At this time, we are going to take our first break for the day. We will see you back at 10:30 for a session on the Property Revitalization Framework, which will be led by Justin Goddard. Enjoy the break, and please be sure to take advantage of the speed networking feature, which you can join by clicking the People button in the reception area. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of the Academy, everyone.
Thank you.